Good afternoon, everybody, or 5 minutes before good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Naomi Alboim, and I teach at the School of Policy Studies, and am delighted to welcome you all here today. Most of you are students at the school. We're delighted for those who are joining us at the school for this Gibson lecture, which we're delighted to host today. There is also live streaming going on upstairs, so don't worry if people are standing at the door. They'll be directed upstairs. We want you to focus on the lecture. I'd like to acknowledge that today's event is happening on the territory upon which Queens sits, which is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people. And we want to extend, I'm still having trouble with these glasses, we want to extend a very special welcome, there he is right there, to Doug Gibson, who is the son of J. Douglas Gibson, who he is here with us today, and his father, in whose honor this lecture is being held. The J. Douglas Gibson Lecture Series was established in 1988 by family and friends to honor the memory of Mr. J. Douglas Gibson, who was the chairman of Queen's University's Board of Trustees from 1969 to 1975. The Gibson Lecture brings to Queen's, and has for the past 30 years, an internationally renowned scholar or a public figure to deliver a public lecture on a topic relevant to the school's mandate. And I can think of no one better and no topic more related to the mandate of the school than Bob Ray, who I must say was my former premier, and the premier who brought me onto, or who invited me into his office for a conversation, and I left his office becoming a deputy minister of a ministry that had never existed before. It was quite an inspirational meeting, I guess, certainly for me, and was a wonderful opportunity. So I would now, for a more formal introduction, would like to introduce our student host, who will take it over from here today, and that is Jerusha Rupakumar of the current MPA student body. And she will both introduce Bob, but also moderate the Slido session afterwards, which she will explain to you. So Jerusha, over to you.
Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the J. Douglas Gibson Lecture in the School of Policy Studies. My name is Jerusha Rupakumar, and I am a member of the MPA class of 2019. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Bob Ray here to speak with us today about the Rohingya crisis. Bob Ray served as Ontario's 21st Premier from 1990 to 1995, and as the interim federal leader of the Federal Liberal Party in 2011 to 2013. He was named Queen's Counsel in 1984, appointed to the Privy Council of Canada in 1998, named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2000, received the Order of Ontario in 2004, and Companion of the Order of Canada in 2015. And in 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed him as a Special Envoy to Myanmar. He now works as a lawyer, negotiator, mediator, and arbitrator with a particular focus on First Nations, Aboriginal, and governance issues. He teaches at the University of Toronto School of Governance and Public Policy and is a widely respected writer and commentator. Mr. Ray's talk is sure to get us thinking and evoke questions. As in the past, we will be using Slido to moderate these questions. For those unfamiliar, you can submit your questions by going to Slido's website at slido.com or by using the app on your phone. The code for today is MPA19. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show up on the screen here. If you don't have a question, please take a moment, whether you are in the audience or watching via live stream, to vote on others' questions that interest you. We will also take a few questions live from the crowd today. You are also invited to stay afterwards for a reception that will take place in the foyer after the lecture. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Mr. Bob Ray.
I have to do something technical, which Naomi will remember is not my major skill set. I have to turn on this microphone. There. Well, thank you very much, Jerusha, and thank you so much, Naomi, and a special thanks to the Gibson family for their generosity in sponsoring this lecture. It's wonderful to be back at Queen's. I have a significant connection with Mr. Gibson in that my brother, John, was also chairman of the Board of Trustees for many years at Queen's and is a Queen's graduate. I didn't get into Queen's. I went to U of T, although I am the recipient of an honorary degree from Queen's, so you can just call me doctor if you're struggling for words. It's a great privilege to be here, and I particularly want to thank my friend John Meisel for being here. He's a hero to many of us who labor in the field of public policy and political studies in Canada. And it's a great fun to visit with him today, and to see him today means a lot to me to have him here, as well as my former colleague in the House of Commons, Mr. Hsu. Ted was a terrific colleague when we were a much smaller group in the House of Commons than the government currently is. Well, it's always difficult for me to do these lectures because I feel an obligation to do writing and to have a text. And again, Naomi will recall these experiences. But I actually don't really like to speak from a text. I much prefer to just talk. So I'm going to start, eventually I'll start wandering over, and I'll be competing for your eyesight as you look at this Slido invention, which I've never encountered before, and hope to retain your attention as we talk about these issues. I want to start by doing something a little different, and that is not by beginning my talk by talking about the Rohingya, but by beginning my talk by talking about some values and issues that are very much in the news today, about populism and democracy, rights. Where is this debate going in Canada and around the world? And to try to link up, if I can, what the implications are of the Rohingya crisis for us as Canadians, and how, in fact, what might seem like a very remote event on literally the other side of the world, how that actually connects very, very much with us, with our values, with our interests, with our concerns. And I'm hoping that I can maintain your interest and focus as I talk about these things. Well, populism is very much in the news these days. I had no idea when I named the title of this lecture that Mr. Harper was going to be writing a book and talking about it in Canada and the United States. And I gather he's even giving a talk tomorrow at the Canadian Club. But I don't think the media are invited. I mean, how that works, I'm not really quite sure. But I would simply say that the issue of populism is very much in the news. And it is a strand of the democratic tradition that is important for us to understand. I say it's a strand because, put simplistically, somewhat simplistically, we can trace two very different ways of looking at democracy. One of them is that it's the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. And that it's a rule that is restrained by really nothing except the will of the majority, the will of the people. And we can trace this strand back to ancient times. We can trace it in modern times, particularly in the Civil War in England in the 17th century, to the French Revolution, in terms of the empowerment of the people and what the people's rule could mean. And we can trace it very much to our own times and our own day. And populism can be a populism of the left, if you like, as in the French Revolution or as in the English Revolution, when the most populist groups were the most radical and the most far afield from the center. And certainly in the French Revolution, you know a little bit about that history, I hope, where we appreciate that there were a whole range of groups that were fighting for control and fighting for dominance, and they were all eventually brushed aside by Napoleon, which led to the famous saying, every revolution has its thermidor, which means at some point chaos ends and order is restored. And usually it's a very authoritarian kind of order that is restored, as it was by Napoleon at the very end of the 18th century. Today, I think we are, in a way, seeing a bit of a debate among academics and scholars about, what are the causes of this modern form of populism, which has led to significant elections and changes in Europe. Obviously, the election of President Trump and our own version of Trumpism, which we are still trying to figure out what it actually means for the province, but the election of Premier Ford. There are, broadly speaking, there are a couple of major schools about how do we explain it. One is the disruption theory, which is, I gather, though I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and I don't expect to get a free autographed copy, is a theory that Mr. Harper apparently has adopted, which is we need to understand populism as a response to disruption. Disruption in the modern economy has been, and the application of new technologies and the speed of technological change and the speed of change generally has created a very real reaction from people, and that it's largely has to be understood as a response to economic disruption. I think that's one component to try to understand the populism of our time, but I think, to be blunt, we also have to understand that, like many other forms of populism in American history and Canadian history, it also has other powerful elements. The first is the fear of the other, the sense that there is an identity that is being taken away by the presence of other people, and that the presence of these others in the midst of the majority is threatening. So you have, powerful anti-Catholic movements in Ontario in the middle of the 19th century, when Ontario was literally inundated by mass migration from Ireland. And so there was a widespread populist movement in the Orange Order and in the English Protestant community that took a hugely negative view of the meaning of the arrival of these Catholics, these foreigners who were coming in and taking over our country. We see it in responses to migration from Asia in Canada in the early 20th century. The response to Japanese migration, response to Chinese migration. And Canadians said, enough, we don't want you here, we're going to limit your numbers, we're not going to allow you to become citizens. In the case of the Japanese, when the Second World War broke out, we're going to take away your property, we're going to take away your boats, we're going to take away your fishing rights, and we're going to put you in camps. Same thing happened in the United States. That's a populist movement, that's a populist response. Public opinion loved it. And here I come to a related point. Populism and public opinion are connected. And one of the things that we have to be very aware of is that when we're criticizing populist movements, we're also sometimes criticizing things that are popular in the moment, at the time, seen as necessary at the moment, at the time, to protect identity, to protect security, to protect a sense of who the we is in we the people. This is not just about Canada or the United States. This is a global phenomenon. And in part, we also need to understand that at the time of the breakup of empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, as in the 1950s and 1960s, the driving force behind the end of those empires was a populist, popular nationalism. Whether it was in India and Pakistan, the horrible division, the horrible consequences of the division of Pakistan and India, the conflict which is still there today, which is still causing tension and rivalry. And we can see it in so many other examples around the world, in Africa, in Asia, the rise of populist nationalism in so many different countries in different ways. It's one of the real powerful institutional changes that is taking place in our time. There is, however, another democratic tradition, which in a way didn't start out as a democratic tradition because it was a liberal tradition. And liberalism was not, in its origins, a democratic phenomenon. Liberalism was about something else. And here I'm speaking small l. Liberalism was about a response to authority that people felt was not legitimate because it was not rational, because it couldn't respond to reason, and because it led to arbitrary decision-making which hurt those who believed in the rule of law, freedom of association, freedom of commerce, and who were a powerful intellectual and political force in every European country and in the United States and in Canada for a long period of time. The liberal tradition in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, became allied with the democratic tradition. But it was an uneasy marriage. It had its downfalls. If you read, for example, the great figures of British liberalism, thinking of John Stuart Mill would be a classic example. In John Stuart Mill's political evolution is fascinating. I could love to talk about that for at least another 20 minutes, but I won't. But what's fascinating about it is he was way ahead of his time on women's rights, equality issues, looking at the forces of change in Europe, understanding the vitality, the importance of liberalism and representative government. But one of the last things he did as an MP was to insist that Oxford and Cambridge should have at least 2 seats, maybe 3, because they were smarter than everybody else. So there's always this concern about liberalism that it has a kind of elitist issue that drives populists nuts and makes them argue powerfully and strongly against the group they call the elites. And the rhetoric of President Trump, I should have come in here today wearing a cap, because we don't have lectures anymore in the United States. We don't have presidential speeches. We just have rallies. And the rally is a classic example of a populist political event. It is intended to whip up the emotion and the sense of oneness in the crowd. And then, of course, the finger points to CNN or to some other journalist or some other who is then made to be a victim of the view of the crowd. So what does this have to do with the Rohingya? The answer is absolutely everything. Because in order to understand the Rohingya, we now have to sort of park what I've just talked about for a moment and have a look at the history in 5 minutes of modern Burma, modern Myanmar. What is it? Well, it was an ancient kingdom, a very ancient kingdom that was profoundly affected by the arrival of Buddhism as a political force, as well as a religious force. And the Irrawaddy River, which is fed by the Himalayas and comes down right through the heart of Myanmar, is created a massive basin, a valley, that was the heartland and is the heartland today of what we would call Bamar civilization, the civilization of the Bamar people. A very literate, a very learned, a very, very deep-seated history that had a monarchical system of government and that had a constant battle for supremacy with other parts of what is today modern Myanmar, particularly in the mountainous regions to the east, the north, and to the west. The first thing we need to understand is that the Bamar kingdom took over the kingdom of Arakan. And Arakan is what we would today call Rakhine. And Rakhine is the state that is on the west coast of Myanmar, on the Bay of Bengal. And again, the Arakan kingdom had an ancient history, their own language, but they themselves were the objects of imperial ambition by the Bamar, and eventually the Bamar kingdom took over the kingdom of Arakan. Write this down because it will come back. History has a way of returning. So to understand the complexity of the conflict in Rakhine, we need to understand that there is a Rakhine majority who are Buddhist, but who are not Bamar, and who see themselves as hard done by, forgotten by the center of the kingdom. Fast forward to the middle of the 19th century, the Brits move in. Expanding into India, taking over the East India Company, turning it into a political organization, and then expanding their sphere of influence and their domination into what they called Burma, and which is today called Myanmar. And they took their gunboats right up the Irrawaddy River, all the way to Mandalay, which was the historic capital of the kings, and took over the country and expelled the king, and in fact forced him to live on the west coast of India, where he lived in exile for the rest of his life. The leadership of the country was decapitated, basically. The legal structures were destroyed. The border between Burma, the Burmese Empire, and the Bengalis was taken away. And Burma was run by the British as if it was part of India. Now, this is very important because we need to understand that what empire meant was that the British said, we will regulate the relations between all these people. And we know they have different religions, and we know they have different languages, and our job is to kind of keep the peace. And oh, by the way, while we're here, we're going to extract as much wealth out of this place as we possibly can. And they did. And as they were doing this, there was a significant movement of population that came from all over India, particularly from Bengal. And so when the movement of independence began in the 1930s, as it did in India, as it did in Ghana, as it did in all over Africa, all over Asia, the movement for independence, these movements were nationalist. They were based on an assertion of language, of religion, of ethnic identity, and the tension that was inherent in that movement was that other ethnic groups and other minorities were not part of the enterprise. It didn't become entirely clear, I think, to a lot of people who, as they see the collapse of empire and the exodus of the Brits and the exodus of the French, that what was left behind was actually a highly conflictual situation, which the Brits managed because they kept their hand on it. By the way, not entirely dissimilar from what was the impact of the evacuation of the Russians from Eastern Europe. Because what communism did, what Stalinism did in Russia and in Eastern Europe was to keep all the ethnic conflicts suppressed. And of course, as soon as empire leaves, well, all the national groups say, here we are, we're still here. And the dominant groups have tremendous trouble recognizing what about the others. So when Aung San, who was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi and who was the founder of the modern Burmese army, when he brought out the slogan, Burma for the Burmese, what did he mean? Did he mean Burma for everybody who lives here and we're all together and we're all going to live in this great country together? No, not exactly. What he meant was, it's our turn, meaning Bamar, it's our turn. So what happened after the 1950s was that there was a major exodus of people because they were told, you don't belong here, you're not citizens, you're not part of our group, you're not with us. And at the same time, there were huge military conflicts between the Bamar and the Burmese army and all of the other national groups, that the Shan and the Chin and all those states that are around in the northern and eastern and western part of Myanmar, those conflicts began with independence and they are still going on today. One of the things the fact-finding mission of the United Nations did, by the way, a brilliant 440-page report, which I would encourage everyone to read, one of the things that created was a civil war that is still not ended. So who are the Rohingya? Why is the use of the word Rohingya controversial even in Myanmar? I don't know if any of you saw Nala Ayed's very, very good reporting from Rakhine and from Myanmar in the last 2 or 3 nights on the CBC. I urge you to have a look at it. It's live streaming, or you can get it on the website. Well, it's an interesting story. There were, going back many, many centuries, Muslims living in Arakan. So the argument that says there have never been Muslims living in Myanmar, and that Muslims are a group of people who are not welcome, they're not native to this soil, really has no particular merit, because there are all kinds of groups that are not Bamar, and some of them are Hindus, some of them are Christians, some of them are Muslim, and they've been living in Bamar for a very, very long time. But their presence has never been fully accepted by the Buddhist majority. And as that majority takes on more and more power and authority, they have exercised their power to marginalize and discriminate against the other. So why is the word Rohingya so contested? Because what Rohingya means is, I'm a person from Rakhine. Rohan is the word for Arakan. So for those who are Arakan nationalists or Myanmar nationalists or Buddhist nationalists or Buddhist populists, the word is an affront, because what it means is, I'm from here. I belong here as much as you do. And for the, again, watch, you could see it on Nala, when you talk to the people on the ground in Rakhine or in Myanmar, when they're not trying to be politically correct, they will describe them as Bengalis, if they're nice. If they're not nice, they'll describe them with another word, which means blacks, because the color of skin is darker than that of the Bamar. So part of what's going on is racism. Part of what's going on is an inability to embrace a liberal, pluralist notion of what a democracy can look like. And one of them is all about retaining control at the center for the people who think like us, if you use that word, us and them. The Rohingya are poor. They were brought in, those who came later. And as soon as I say these things, I know I'm going to get emails and text messages from my friends who will say, well, you got this little bit of history wrong. I think the fairest way to say it is that there were a lot of Muslims and people from Arakan who would have considered themselves to be Rohingya long before the arrival of the British. But there's no doubt that when you get rid of a border, people will move in and out. And so, yes, some of them came from Bengal. But the reality is the Rohingya have been there for a very, very long time. And just as in Sri Lanka, we can trace a large movement of Tamils from India to Sri Lanka in response to a British request saying, we need people who will help us build up the tea industry in Sri Lanka. And those people are called Hill Tamils. And the Tamils in Sri Lanka didn't really think of the Hill Tamils as being exactly like them, because the Tamils in the north of Sri Lanka can trace their relationship to the country to a migration that took place thousands of years before. So the conflict that we've seen has been one that effectively you can understand it, you can give a history of it, you can look at the narratives that compete, you can go as a foreigner and say, well, I think I understand this, I think I get this, and, what about, and we try to find the solutions, but the reality is that there is a real problem in what populist movements and governments will do and how little they really care about the protection of minorities, people who are different from them. It enrages Myanmar politicians, Aung San Suu Kyi, all of them. It enrages them all that foreigners would have such a view and so little understanding of the real history and story of the country. It enrages them that the world does not appreciate the challenges of dealing with a difficult political and religious situation, and how the Rakhine Buddhists feel that their land has been taken away by the Muslims and that they're not allowed to come back into their own politically as a result of independence. But what we have to say is, yes, you might not be glad or happy with the way in which liberal ideas like the rule of law, like the protection of minorities, like the International Declaration of Human Rights, like the entire legal architecture which a liberal world order has created since 1945. And so when we see the signs of exactly parallels the genocidal side of populism, of where ultimately it can go, if not restrained, if not dealt with properly. We in the West, or we anywhere, who believe in the rule of law, who believe in the protection of minorities, who believe that religion and languages should be respected within a pluralist vision of society, we have a hell of a time. Because there was a time when that liberal world order was widely accepted by a number of people. But we need to understand something. Many of the attempts that have been made to formalize the protection of human rights have been resisted by the very countries that now make up a majority of the United Nations. The two strongest opponents of this idea of the duty to protect against genocide, following the Rwanda disaster were China and India, supported, of course, by the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, it passed. It passed in the Security Council. China just didn't have the stomach to veto it. But there were very powerful dissents and warning signs from those governments saying, this sounds a lot to us like imperialism. This sounds a lot to us like you simply want to impose your order and your values on our countries. And you are attempting to engage in an act of neo-colonialism by effectively telling us what to do. So these are some of the enormous tensions that are created by the current crisis. And while it's true, Parliament can say it's a genocide, and while it's true, Parliament can say to Aung San Suu Kyi, we don't consider what's happened compatible with your being an honorary citizen, we also need to figure out the most difficult question about these liberal values which we certainly I espouse, and that is, what are you going to do about it? Not what are you going to say about it, but what are you going to do about it? And here there's a little allegorical story that I'll tell you for about 3 minutes. And that is Andrew Jackson, whose face we all recognize from the American $20 bill. And Kingston, you're right on the border here. I'm sure some point in your lives you will cross over and see, even in the current circumstance, those of you who are allowed to get in will be able to get your $20 bill. Andrew Jackson was the first really populist American president. He was a populist representative of the settler population in the United States. He was a frontier guy, and he was supported by all the other frontier guys. And by the way, women didn't have the right to vote, so it really was frontier guys. And one of the ongoing disputes in the United States in the early 19th century and later, parallel to ours in Canada, was between the settler population and the Aboriginal people. And there was an indigenous group in Georgia that had a huge nation, a huge territory in Georgia, the Cherokees. And as more and more settlers started pouring into Georgia, the state legislature said, you know, that land you guys have got, we really want that land. We like that land. Why should you have that land? Why do you run it like a collective? Why do you run it like you're a nation inside our country? We want that land. We're going to take over that land. And the Cherokees said, well, no, we've got a treaty. You don't understand. We signed a treaty with the federal government, and the federal government has to uphold our treaty. So the case went to court. And John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the United States, said, Cherokees are right. They have a treaty. And Andrew Jackson, who disagreed completely with the Supreme Court, disagreed completely with John Marshall, disagreed completely with his notion of the rule of law, Andrew Jackson said, well, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it. And we're in the same boat as the Cherokees. And as, of course, you know what happened, right? Many of you will have heard of the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees were forced out. Probably one of the greatest contemporary descriptions of that whole story is told by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. For some reason, I've been rereading my de Tocqueville now as I watch what's going on in the United States. And what de Tocqueville said was, this was a terrible, terrible tragedy. It should never have happened. Thousands of people lost their lives in the Trail of Tears as they were evacuated from Georgia and ended up in Oklahoma Territory. But what are you going to do? And we face the same dilemma today internationally. We have laws. We have a report from the UN fact-finding mission. We have clear evidence of a forcible deportation, but we have a significant gap between what we believe happened and what a vigorous international world order should do about it, and what we actually are able and prepared politically to do about it. Now, another part of this story, which I won't get into because it gets a little complicated, of course, is our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, where for particular reasons, and Syria, where for particular reasons, powerful forces said, we'll do something. Look what happened in Yugoslavia. The former Yugoslavia, the UN did respond. The NATO did respond. The West responded. Is there a similar political will to respond politically to what's going on with the Rohingya? 750,000 people forcibly moved, living in the worst possible conditions in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. Another 200,000, 300,000 left in the most vulnerable conditions in Rakhine, many of them living in difficult conditions in an IDP camp. What are we actually prepared to do? People say, bring in sanctions. Well, I got news for everybody. The country next door to Myanmar is a little country called China. China, during all the period that there were sanctions against Myanmar that were carried out by the EU and the West, Canada was part of it, during the time of the military dictatorship, China just said, great, you guys want to do that? We've got lots of room here. They did deals with the army. They've moved in major ways. They're building pipelines. They're investing in jade. They're investing in mining. They're powerfully there. The Indians, similarly, there. The other Asian countries are all there. We might like to think that we can create an effective international order that will actually implement sanctions in a significant way. But the trouble that we have is that international law, the architecture is there, the norms are there, the enforcement capacity is not there. And that's the tragedy that we face. If you were to talk to an Indigenous person in Canada, they might say the same thing. They might say the Supreme Court has made all these judgments, but why do we have to keep going back to court all the time? The reason is because provincial and federal governments don't always implement the decisions the way that you might think the courts would have expected. So we have this gap, this enforcement gap. And that's the key challenge that we face. So I'm going to close with these just couple of comments. The problem with where we are today is that we're living in a world without adult supervision. And the tragedy for us is that we're in a situation that is not entirely dissimilar to the situation that the world faced in the years between 1918 and 1940. Massive disruption, a period of huge, devastating unemployment, the rise of populist movements in Italy and then in Germany, the inability of international institutions to stop any of the expansionist steps that were taken. And at the end of the Second World War, we said, we're going to fix this. We're not going to go back to this world where there's no enforcement and there's no norms and there's no international law. We're going to put people on trial in Nuremberg. We're going to establish democracy in Germany and Japan. We're going to eventually establish a Marshall Plan which will allow Western Europe to come back to a strong. We're going to agree on how we're going to move forward with NATO. We've seen isolationism in the United States rising again, and with the determination to say, well, we don't believe in the EU. We don't believe in the ICC. We don't really like the UN very much. We don't want the WTO telling us what to do on trade. We want to break out of this structure and as the president said when he was nominated, gave his inaugural address, always America first. Well, Thomas Crushane is here. He'll know that one of Laurier's famous comments was Canada first, last, and always. But I don't think he had quite the same thing in mind as what Donald Trump had in mind when he said always America first. Because we need to understand what the implications of that are for the rule of law internationally, for the protection of minorities, and for the enforcement of common standards. What it effectively means is that when you say, I am always going to put myself first, others will say, well, then you can't be the captain of the team anymore because you're not on the team. There is no team. You have destroyed the team. And when you destroy the team, you can do whatever you want to do, but it's going to be harder for everybody else to join in and say, yes, we're part of this exercise. And we know, having seen these trade negotiations, we know what that means. And I know there are people who are critical of aspects of the negotiated result, but let's remember, we have no leverage, really. The fact is, we're not able, if we want a trade deal, we have to pay. We've been told for the first time by an American president, you want this, you got to pay. This is what you got to do. And I think in a sense, we gave up as little as we possibly could in the circumstances, and then said it's a victory. So it's tough times. But I think one of the things that is going to start to happen is that not just Canada, but a number of other countries as well, that still kind of keep this idea alive of creating vibrant, strong international institutions that have the capacity to enforce their will, that have the ability to do that. And I also think that domestically and in other ways, it means that we have to stand up for another kind of politics. Because we need to understand that there's something very wrong with a populism that doesn't respect the rule of law, that doesn't respect due process, that doesn't respect diversity, pluralism, and the protection of minorities. And that understands that the very reason why we have a charter is because it's intended to protect the causes and issues and people who are not popular. And that's not just a charter. The whole reason we have an historic rule of law going back deep into the common law structures of England and of France is because we know that if you take away the rights of the deepest, darkest criminal, you risk taking away the rights of everybody else. And that if you justify seizing people, throwing them in jail, and providing no justification, no trial, no protection, well, where does that stop? What does it do? And so we need to reassert, both in our own thinking and our own politics, why this embrace of the rule of law is so important. We also have to understand the challenge that we face both at home and abroad is the same. And that is, how do we make the rule of law the real rule of the people? And that, I think, is a challenge that the Rohingyas are facing. It's a challenge we're facing in terms of our policies, and we will continue to face it going forward. Thank you very much. Here we come. Here comes Sligo.
So we will now begin the question and answer period. So the first question on the screen is, do you think the West chooses which genocides and displacements to address based on what benefits them? For example, Syrian and Somalian, Yemeni, and Palestine refugee crisis.
I don't think it's just the West. I mean, I think there is we do need to have a more global way of looking at issues. I think we failed, the world has failed Syria miserably. I think we failed terribly in terms of our failure to intervene. I think we realize now, since a dispute that's been going on for literally 100 years between those who became Israelis and those who are Israelis and Palestinians, has proved to be incredibly intractable and difficult. I don't believe that a genocide describes that particular conflict in definitional terms. I think in definitional terms, I think what happened to the Yazidis definitely does. I think there are other examples one could look at and say these are taking on the elements of a genocide. And I think we need to understand that, one of the mistakes that people make, and I watched it on TV last night, where someone said, from Rakhine, somebody was saying, well, you couldn't call it a genocide because we didn't kill them all. There's still some left. And you sort of say, actually, that doesn't work. I mean, that's really not the definition. It's also not the test. But it's sort of a view out there, which is that the only way you have a genocide is when you've eliminated absolutely everybody, and that means it's a genocide. And that just isn't the international law definition of what is a genocide. But yeah, I do think there is a reality that some issues are taken up by some groups and some governments more than others. And I think one of the things we need to do as Canadians is say, let's begin a comprehensive discussion of where these disputes are happening, where these issues are there, and how we rate these conflicts and what we think we can do to stop them. And I think that has to be part of what we do as a country.
So the next question is, today the Supreme Court ruled that there is no duty to consult with Indigenous people before introducing legislation. What does this say of the rule of law?
I saw a summary of the Mikisew decision, which has just come out this morning. I have not yet had a chance to read it, so it would be highly risky for me as a professor to say this is what it says and this is what it means. I think what it says to me is that if you think you can rely exclusively on the courts to protect process and the rule of law, you're sadly mistaken. In fact, our jurisprudence is full of decisions that make it very clear that the judges don't think this is a question for them. They think it's a political process. And as I said, I haven't had an opportunity to read the decision yet, so I don't know. I expect part of what they said, at least, was before legislation is introduced, there's a political process that goes on inside a government as to what the legislation will look like. And it may be that as a legal requirement, not as a political requirement, but as a legal requirement, a government, parliament is, and a government is allowed to have a law and say, okay, now let's discuss it. Now the question then becomes, well, what are the other remedies that apply once that law is passed and once it's proclaimed? But beyond that, I can't say. As I said, I think summarily what I would say is it means that the rule of law is as much a political requirement as it is a legal requirement, and sometimes we need to understand the difference between those two things.
You were talking about how to deal with populism before it becomes increasingly violent and exclusionary. How is that populism combated?
Well, I think one of the ways it's combated is by naming it. And I think we've been too reluctant to name it, and I think we've been too reluctant to take it on in a systematic way. And I think we need to understand better how, in my eyes, a populism that is not tempered by the rule of law, that is not tempered by, if you like, liberal values, is always going to be problematic. It's just a matter of degree as to how far it goes in doing simply what's popular at the moment. And You know, my father wrote a book with George Gallup many, many years ago called The Pulse of Democracy, which is about the early days of polling in the United States. And when I asked my father years later why he left that work to join the government in the war, he said, because sometimes you learn that turning heads is more important than counting heads. I thought that was a great way of looking at it. That, I mean, not the first time I thought my father was right about something, but certainly early on in that discovery on my part. And I think it's a very wise comment, because I think we need to understand that popular opinion changes. Public opinion changes. Opinion in this class changes. Our own personal opinions change. Many of you don't have the same views you had last year on a given subject or 5 years ago. So why would we be afraid of debate, and why wouldn't we distinguish between what seems to be popular at the moment and then what needs to be seen as the best basis for policy? And I think that's one of the debates we need to have in policy. Sometimes the things we advocate, we need to understand they're not popular, but they're based on the facts and they're based on reason, and we need to understand that the basis of free inquiry, the basis of liberal institutions like universities, is not necessarily because everything taught in a university is popular with everybody outside the university. That's the way it is. That's why we see this distinction.
Can you please give us an idea on what Myanmar and international community is doing right now to address the Rohingyas that they brutally forced to move out?
Well, how long have I got? It's not easy to describe I think there's things going on in the following areas. What's taken place has raised the following 4 or 5 big issues. The first one is the issue of accountability. Who did this? And what is this? And then how do we get a process established that will allow us to determine who should be held accountable for this? This is full of problems, because Myanmar is not a signatory to the ICC. Bangladesh is. So there's one small, or one not small, but one particular potential crime against humanity, forcible deportation, which the International Criminal Court has said, we will look at that because the crime is not completed until people get to Bangladesh, and because Bangladesh is a signatory, the ICC is saying we may have jurisdiction. So that's a little glimmer of hope. The fact-finding mission, which I've spoken of earlier, has urged that the UN support the creation of what's called a mechanism, a place where evidence can be gathered, where we can deal with the growing body of evidence about what's taken place. There's a huge number of reports out there from governments, from international agencies, from NGOs, outlining the extent of what's happened, the number of lives lost, how they were killed, ways in which they were killed, why this is seen as such a significant issue. The second big issue is what's going on in Myanmar. And there we're having problems. The government of Myanmar has signed agreements with 2 agencies of the UN saying, yes, we will let you come and see what's going on in Rakhine, but in fact, access is very, very limited. And so it's very difficult for people to get in to see what's happening in Rakhine, who's left, what's in place. And if you saw any of the footage from Nala Ayed over the last couple of days, you will have seen how difficult it was for her and her cameras to get real access to where they wanted to go and what they wanted to see. The government of Myanmar says, well, we're going to establish our own commission on who did what. But there's a lot of reason to say, we're not quite sure that's really going to work, because we don't think you're going to have the independence and the capacity that you need to be able to carry out a real inquiry. So there's all sorts of issues around how slow the reform process is in Myanmar and how committed they are to allowing for the fair, full return of the Rohingya to the land that they have lived in for these hundreds of years. There's an issue, a big humanitarian issue with respect to, well, what do we do for the people who are in Bangladesh in these terrible conditions? How can we improve the conditions? And finally, there's some issues around, can we get a bunch of countries to work better together, to share information and push this file forward? And Canada's trying to work on that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm still, quote, the special envoy, because the government wants me to continue to work with some other people who have similar job titles as I do to say, well, what can we do to really make a difference? And finally, I have to say that the one part of my report which the government did not really embrace as fully as I might have liked was the area on how does Canada deal with the refugee crisis itself by saying we want to take people in. And I suggested that the government needed to begin to have an active discussion internally about how this should happen. And government said, yes, we'll have an active discussion internally, but don't expect any instantaneous announcements about how this might happen. So the situation is tough, it's dire, but it's not without a number of doors and places where we continue to push. It's frustrating, but if somebody's got a better idea, I'd love to hear what it is, because we're always looking for ways in which we can try to make a difference.
So we are in our last 5 minutes. Could I take any questions on the floor?
Sir.
The world is shifting towards a digital world. How is it impacting populism, politics, and democracy?
Well, again, that's a huge question. I'm sure there's courses on that in the university, and I look forward to understanding it better itself. But I think it's an enormous issue. It's full of risks and pluses and minuses. But I mean, I think we as Canadians would be wise to go back to Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan and start to really understand how these modes of communication have an impact. There are many people who say, for example, that without the digital revolution, we would not have had an Arab Spring. Now, we look back now at the Arab Spring and say, yeah, but, what happened? And the answer is, frankly, that people didn't realize that the internet allows people to express themselves, but it also allows people to express themselves. And sometimes what they have to say is awful. In the case of Myanmar, there's a lot of evidence that Facebook was basically taken over as a site, as the favorite site for hate speech. And the problem of hate speech in Myanmar is profound in arousing popular responses. One of the things that happened as a result of the decision by the military and Aung San Suu Kyi, they jointly agreed that we'll open up the country to social media, we'll open up the gates to whatever's going on. And you might think that, well, this is going to be a flowering of democracy and it's going to be a wonderful expression of liberal thought. No, that's not what happened. But there are many people, McLuhan said, you wouldn't have had Hitler without radio. On the other hand, you probably wouldn't have had FDR without radio. You wouldn't have had Kennedy winning the debate with Nixon without television, because the people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon was better than Kennedy. They said, that guy, look, he looks, this other guy's so much better looking and so much more telegenic. He won. I think one of the things that certainly happened as a result of the internet was, one is it's a 24/7 news cycle. It's going all the time. It means that we have a collective problem with attention deficit disorder. Governments have a terrible time staying focused, understanding that, it actually takes time to make decisions. It actually takes time to come up with a good policy. It takes time to implement it. And I think it's hard for governments, for political parties to do that effectively. They're very responsive to the crisis of the moment. On the other hand, I'll tell you one story, which I thought was fascinating. I was talking to a young man in a refugee camp in Sitwe, which is the largest town in Rakhine, largest city in Rakhine. And he was in an IDP camp. He was Rohingya. And he was about 18 or 19 years old. And we were chatting away, and he was talking in English. I said, "Where did you learn your English? It's quite good." But it had a lot of kind of, I don't know, sort of expressions which, you know, I said, "Those are really interesting expressions." I said, "Where did you learn your English?" He said, "I have a cell phone. I watch American movies on my cell phone. I repeat what the cell phone says, what the expression is, and then I figure out what it means. And then I use it." I mean, you know, if it wasn't for that little cell phone, he wouldn't have access to this world, and he wouldn't have access to the internet, and he wouldn't have access to being able to understand. So, I mean, my view is don't rail against the media. You know, I mean, the techniques of it, I mean, rail against a particular paper or something else, but don't rail against the technology. Try to figure out how to make it a force for good. And I think that's what we always have to do. You know, how do we make these things a force for good when so clearly on their own they can just be junkyards, you know, and that's what we need to understand. I would, by the way, make it, I would make it impossible for somebody to go on the internet anonymously. Because I think the use of anonymity as a way of hiding who you are, not only from the public, but even from the owners of the network, I think is very bad. I think you have to take responsibility for what you say. And if you defame somebody, which happens all the time, at least have the courage to come forward and say, okay, I said this. And I think that's something we need to think about, as what is the best, what kind of policies can we have that will actually deal with the unlimited nature. We're sort of like at a point where we're right after the invention of the motor car. We said, we got to have speed limits. We got to have rules about alcohol. We got to have rules about how old you're going to be. And people would say, no, we want to be free. It's freedom on the highway. We got to be able to freedom. Say, no, actually, you're impacting other people. Same thing's true for the internet. You say, yeah, we don't want to limit freedom, but we want to make sure that freedom is compatible with other people's freedoms. It's not about taking away freedoms. It's about saying, rights collide. I have a right to drive safely. I think we should have rules of the road, and I think we need to have rules of the road for the internet.
That will conclude the question and answer period. I would just like to thank you on behalf of the School of Policy Studies and the MPA class of 2019 for your stimulating lecture on the core issues of the Rohingya crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.